Hello and welcome to this brief but hopefully informative lecture on game design documentation. This lecture will act as an introduction to the various types and uses for game design documents. So, design documentation. If you're not familiar with terms like design document or GDD, then it can seem like a bit of a mystery box. And my aim today is to give you an overview of the most common types of games design document and how they're made. So first up, what is design documentation? Who makes it? Who reads it? What are they for? Then we'll look at what kinds of documentation there are. So spoilers, there's quite a few. What are those types? When should you use one versus another? What do you want to include? And then we'll cover some best practices. So things like, what does good documentation look like? What are some top tips, some do's and don'ts, and some sort of practices that you can apply to your own design documentation. We'll then conclude, just wrap up and summarise what we've touched on. So what is design documentation? Plainly put, design documentation is the dry reality of working as a games designer. You've done all the hard work, you've solved the tricky design problems, but no problem is finished until the paperwork is done. There are a bunch of different things that we can mean when we talk about design documentation. There are a lot of types, shapes, sizes and names for various design documents. And they cover different functions that documents will fulfill at various points of games development. So some that you may have heard of are the Games Design Document, or GDD. You may have heard of pitch deck or game pitch. Hopefully you've heard of design briefs, and ones which you may not have heard of but are worth noting here is the 1-pager and the 10-pager. Now, not to worry if these are unfamiliar to you, we will go into a bit more detail later, but for now the important thing to know is that games design documentation is a thing that exists and it's used in the creation of development, and more often than not it will be the designer's job to create, maintain and update this documentation. So at this point you might be wondering, why do we need all of this documentation? And the reason is simple. Games are complicated. So making a game requires a lot of different skill sets. Games have audio, visual and technical complexities. They're made by multidisciplinary teams, could be consisting of coders, artists, producers, audio designers, quality assurance people, and a mix of other stakeholders. And they have a lot of components that each have their own unique technical or artistic challenges. All of these individual components need to work together in order to create that rewarding and enjoyable player experience. And even games that may appear simple at first can actually have complex rules, mechanics and systems underlying that need to be broken down, understood and defined by the game designer. Using Go Bananas as an example, the player's goal is relatively simple: collect the bananas before the timer runs out. The level navigation is straightforward, and the monkey has many different movement options available to facilitate this. The only punishment to having a low skill is a lower score. But there are a number of hidden design rules and systems that add complexity. One of these is the scoring multiplier. So collecting bananas will increase the score, but collecting them quickly in succession will increase your score multiplier. This increases the value of each subsequently collected banana. And the amount of bananas required to reach a multiplier tier increases with each multiplier tier that is earned. So it starts with 5 to reach a 2x multiplier, then 10 for 3x, and so on. This scales to the point where if you have a 40x multiplier, you would then need to collect 200 bananas in order to get the 41x multiplier. There is a banana cooldown timer also that counts down between collections. This resets after each banana is collected. If the player fails to collect a banana before the countdown timer ends, then the multiplier is lost. And the game communicates this to the player in a variety of ways. First off, the banana score is displayed whenever the player collects one, and this value changes to reflect the current multiplier. The multiplier is also shown when it's above 1x on the HUD. And next to this is the cooldown meter, which will display how much time the player has left to collect the next banana without losing their multiplier. There's also a complex level selection happening. So levels are selected from different pools based on a number of factors. The first one being the total number of levels that the player has completed in their lifetime with the game. The second one being the current number of levels the player has completed this run. Levels are also split into pools based on the environment and type. There are 4 different types of level, starting with the standard level, the mechanics level, the small level, and the bonus level. Now, these levels vary depending on the size of the level, the number of bananas that can spawn in them, and the number of bonus items that can spawn. Other features are also changed depending on the level type, namely things like what obstacles or bonus blocks may spawn. All levels must have at least 1 banana placed in them, and this is to do with the way that the stage clear logic works. Also, each environment must have at least 1 level of each type. These systems have been added to solve a few design problems. The level selection logic adds some variety. It ensures that you don't play the same level twice on a run. It also means that some levels can be completed faster, giving players that sense of accomplishment, and adds a bit of ambiguity to when this reward can be achieved. Similarly, the multiplier, which the player is given a lot of information about the various states of, encourages players and rewards them to keep moving, and it really adds to that feel of frantic dashing around as they move quickly to maintain the multiplier. There's also a bit of strategic choice that it adds to players' decisions as they choose which way to go. Should they run towards the cluster of bananas at first, or collect the loose ones and maximise the multiplier before diving into the cluster? A lot of this design complexity is invisible to players, but it's important to create that desired player experience, which is fast, frantic, arcade gameplay. And designers need to be able to clearly communicate functionality that a game is needing so that they can deliver that desired player experience and that the game team will be able to make it. And one way that we do this is documentation. It's one of the most valuable communication tools that a designer can utilize. Good design documentation means that everyone making the game can contribute productively and effectively. It means that their efforts are focused on making the game to the desired specification. The type and even quantity of documentation that is required to be created can vary on a number of different factors. First one being the type of game that you're making may affect it. What genre is it in? Some genres can also be very dense with systems and mechanics, which would probably require quite a lot of documentation. Others, not so much. The team size is another factor. So if you're working with a very large team, then you might find yourself having to create a lot of very detailed and accurate, up-to-date documentation so that everyone can be kept in the loop. The project timeline is also another factor, so if it's a very tight deadline, then it might be that you just don't have the required time to do a lot of documentation, and you'll be documenting only the absolute minimum amount of information. Even something like your specific role within a design team can affect how much documentation is required. For example, level designers working on Agrabah's Pop would have very minimal documentation. In fact, they would create only the level number that specifies where it appears on the map, the game mode, which affects the objective and the playable characters, and the only other sort of thing they might record is a screenshot of the starting layout of the game. From there on, their focus was primarily on balancing and documentation, which would record the scores and the difficulty or the move count for the levels. This because this was the main sort of drivers of player engagement. But regardless of these factors, it's unlikely that you would spend your career as a designer and never be required to create some form of design documentation. So it's useful to be aware of their application, and in my experience, a lot of time working as a designer is actually spent writing documentation, updating it, and discussing it with your team. The main reason that designers spend a lot of time creating documentation is because design has a unique role in games development. Design decisions shape the mechanics, the systems, game world, and ultimately player experience, which is a broad area of responsibility. Where an artist might focus on the visual presentation and a coder on technical implementation of a feature, it's the designer's job to plan the intended player experience. Now, this often means that designers become a central point of contact on teams between the different disciplines, because their design decisions are responsible for generating a lot of tasks and development activity, and this all needs to be completed to make the game. So effective communication is something all designers should be confident with and practice at, from Michael Killick, The Way We Play, Theory of Games Design. Design decisions have a significant impact on the work of other disciplines, and therefore have a high degree of risk associated with them. If those decisions are not well considered or rigorously tested, they can impact the delivery of the project. Good designers spend a lot of time identifying risks and designing solutions which mitigate or avoid those risks altogether. Documentation can also be a useful tool to validate design decisions, de-risk features by planning them out accurately. Designers can be confident they have made strong decisions that deliver the player the right game experience. Clear, concise design documentation helps teams' communication and understand the design vision. It also allows the game team to execute on that vision. Documentation gets the idea out of your head and into everyone else's. Welcome to the world of documentation. Let's look at the most common types of documentation in more detail. This is the typical sort of order that you might create documents in, looking from left to right, each one following the other. Starting with the design brief, this defines the goals and expectations for the project and can be used to validate design decisions at each stage. Ideation is used to record lots of ideas and communicate them quickly and easily, and facilitate any discussion or decision making. Concept stage is sometimes called a one-pager, takes that idea a little bit further and starts to list out some key features. At outline, or sometimes also known as 10-pager, is when you flesh out a concept into a fuller version and try to understand the full scope that this game might be. Finally, GDD, or Games Design Document, must be completed sort of before development on a particular feature or system can commence. So this is a full system breakdown to understand everything that needs to be done to make it. This is a sort of typical order that you might expect to create these documents in, but let's explore them all in a little bit more detail. So start with the design brief. The design brief is sort of your quest giver. It sets the goals for the designers, but of course rather than asking you to kill 10 rats, it might be more something like design a match 3 game which has some elements of Pokemon Go and geolocation. Or it could be a boomer shooter using a branded IP license, maybe a multiplayer augmented reality room game where players are using their sort of phones to interact and control an environment, things like that. So the design briefs, like a quest giver, come in many different forms, and they could typically start as maybe a conversation or an email, even an instant message from stakeholders or product owners or client requests, but sometimes they can even come from suggestions from within the team. These can all be sort of valid starting points for a brief. And in cases where there is no sort of formal documentation, then I would recommend you actually write one up just to ensure that you're recording all the important information that you need. This can then be shared and then agreed as the project moves forward. Design briefs are typically short documents anyway, and you shouldn't be expected to spend too much time on them. But they would hopefully include at least some of the following information. We'll start with those high-level sort of project goals, so similar to the above examples, maybe just a few bits of extra detail as needed. Then you want to sort of understand what the expectations for the game are, so what is the genre, the gameplay features, do you have some understanding of game length, or do you need to use a specific IP or character or similar sort of constraints or expectations. Next would be sort of target audience, so do they have any sort of expectations as well that you need to be aware of, and this might affect the design decisions which you make. So kind of maybe a typical example there would be a racing game where players might expect a realistic sort of physics simulation or real-world car manufacturers and vehicles to be represented in the game. They might even anticipate sort of real-world locations and tracks to be present also. So this is obviously a design consideration you need to take into account. Next would be make sure you include something like platform that you're targeting. Is it going to be a PC game, console game, or perhaps mobile or other sort of platform with specific requirements? Next, is there any specific theming or branding that needs to be taken into consideration here as well? Again, some of these sort of speak to each other. Next up would be something like monetization. So is it clear what the price point will be for this game? Is it going to be a free-to-play premium game? Is there any sort of live service or additional DLC expectations that also need to be sort of accounted for at this stage? Having some sort of notion of the development budget or timeline is also sort of valuable. It just gives you a way to sort of scope appropriately your suggestions. And then sort of lastly, mapping out what the potential risks or opportunities would be. So if your team that you're going to be making this game with has made similar games in the past, then this would be potentially an opportunity. So it means you're hopefully very skilled and adept at creating that type. Equally, if you've never made a particular type of game and this is your first sort of attempt at it, then that would be a risk. Yes, so some of these questions you may be able to answer quite easily, others may be unknown, but the point of writing the brief is to sort of establish what is known and what is not known. And it's generally just good practice to try and sort of record any key information you can, as it may impact your design. And the brief will also be used as a guide to assess and validate your design decisions at each step. But once the brief is written, you can move on to the fun part. Ideation. The aim of any ideation step is quite simple. Generate as many fun ideas as possible in a short amount of time. Ideas can be loose, high level, and shouldn't be restricted or interrogated too deeply at this point. It's really about quantity over quality. And in that sense, ideas are like grunts. The common kind of weak enemies that you're going to meet in a video game. You know, kind of cannon fodder, seemingly endless, for the most part disposable, and you don't want to spend too much time on any of them. There's no defined format or sort of information requirements for an ideation document. Instead, it should focus on what makes the most sense for the game or the design problem that you're trying to solve. The main function of an ideation document is to record ideas and communicate them quickly and easily. There should always be sort of high-level solutions, and you can figure out details later. Things you may want to think about when communicating your idea is, can you describe it using an X statement, or perhaps put it into an elevator pitch? Describe the game using only a single sentence, or maybe 3 to 5 bullet points gets the idea across better. Pictures or mood boards always helpful, and I enjoy the game X meets game Y sort of format just to quickly and succinctly put an idea in someone's head. Feeling that sort of mind maps are also useful to explore themes and gameplay connections. You basically want to get as many ideas down in as short amount of time as possible, with little validation or critical evaluation of the effectiveness. That would come later. So an ideation document is a way to quickly and easily share those ideas and then compare against the brief. Basically said, you want to get it out of your head and onto paper so you can discuss. A good process, once you've accumulated your ideas, is to then validate against the brief and then select the strongest idea before moving to the next stage, which is concept development. So sometimes referred to as a one-pager, this is the next notch up in difficulty from ideation. And in that sense, it's like soldiers, a little tougher than sort of the cannon fodder of the grunts, certainly a little less common, maybe better armed, maybe smarter. And they do things like, take cover before they jump out and attack, and they require just that little bit more thought and consideration of how you're going to tackle and approach them. And it's sort of a similar sort of change in strategy from ideation to one-pager. So primarily, it's still a sort of selling document. You're sort of trying to put across the high-level concept of the game. They're quite short still in terms of time investment, and you would be expected to sort of churn out a few of them fairly rapidly. Things you probably want to include in your one-pager are things like a summary of the game, sort of just a few sentences or a paragraph describing the game. What does it feel like to play? You'll be using a kind of emotive, evocative language. You're selling that experience, want to get people excited about the game so that they can then go on and make the game. You should have identified your target audience, who's the game for. This will tell us what sort of games they like, what do they expect. Your target platform, so similar to audience, does this tell us any sort of more about expectations or introduce any sort of unexpected constraints or extra sort of things we need to take into account, technical or otherwise? Game genre, again, sort of will set scope, help us sort of identify potential competitors and the market size that we'll be sort of selling into. Key features and USP. So what is the unique sort of selling points for your game? Why is this game going to be cool and interesting and exciting to play and to make? Gives us a sort of a full picture of the game, and helps us sort of start to answer some of those audience and genre expectations. Game loop is also quite useful here in that it will sort of start speaking to the player experience. So do we know what the sort of goals and actions and feedback sort of progress is going to be? Player journey and progression is sort of next. So what is that player experience going to be like over time with your game? How long do we expect players to be playing it? What are those sort of early game experiences, mid game experiences, late game experiences going to be like? This only has to be sort of loose sort of estimates, but gives us a sense of the value proposition for the game. And finally, competitor titles. is very useful here. So what kind of comparable products are we have we identified? This can be helpful for sort of ensuring that we understand what sort of features and scope are important and can sort of start planning those early. So sort of identifying those kind of core mechanics, getting a rough idea of what sort of systems and things we're going to use to sort of try and stand out. What is the sort of rough shape of the sort of content of this game going to be? Why is this concept one that's worth making, basically? And of course, does it satisfy the brief? Is sort of the questions we would ask before we move on to the next step. The game outline. Sometimes this is called a 10-pager, and this aims to define the full scope of the game. You want to have a high-level understanding of all systems and content in the game. So I would equate this to the elite foes that you meet in games. These are the harder fights. They are sort of tough, resilient enemies that really pack a punch. You're going to need to focus your efforts in order to defeat these guys. Maybe consider very carefully what sort of tools and tactics you're going to use to combat them. And then, of course, you need to execute those tools and tactics with very little margin for error. And this is what the 10-pager is asking of your design skills. So it's a complete but high-level breakdown of the full game. Now the document is used to define the full scope of systems and content that will be needed for the final game. So it's no longer about selling the idea. This is about understanding what it's going to take to make the game. And each component should be listed and described briefly. The specific components may change depending on your game, but they should include some of the following. So a summary of the game, sort of describing the experience. If there's a story, you want to sort of have that in a sort of high-level way, so beginning, middle, and end, understand what that's going to be. You want to be listing all the mechanics, all of the systems, all of the content in your game. It's really just sort of rough estimates. You're describing these in a sentence or two, but you want to make sure that you're calling out all of the specific elements. So if your game has inventory system, a save system, any sort of other rewards and mechanics and things like that, you want to be listing them all out and briefly explaining what they are. Next up would be sort of understanding what the presentation and thematics of it is. So what is function and what is sort of thematics. Next, your sort of key game references are important here as well. What you're going to be doing at this stage is sort of just revisiting the sort of competitor titles that you've identified, ensuring they're still accurate, and then sort of diving in a bit more detail into those games, understanding what is their feature set so that you can make intelligent and informed decisions on your game's feature set. And is it going to be comparable, or where it's not comparable, why is it not, and understanding your decisions there. This just helps design sort of make strong decisions, essentially. So we understand sort of what other games do to make their games fun, and we can do the same. You also want to start sort of planning how you're going to sort of de-risk development here as well, and this is why the outline is super helpful. By understanding what sort of competitor features have added, we can also sort of, again, set our own. You decide what's the important systems and mechanics, what ones maybe have a higher risk associated with them, and then you can prioritize that for the next step of prototyping and sort of mapping out sort of actual gameplay. These can also be used to inform your pitch deck later. We'll discuss those in a minute. Also avoids sort of the guesswork or sort of vague answers that you might otherwise end up with. And of course, as always, once you've completed your outline, you refer back to your brief and ask, is this good enough? Can we move forward to the next step? GDD, or Games Design Document. So this is the final step before you can begin making the game. He's the final boss. He's the biggest, the baddest, the toughest, the hardest sort of documentation challenge you're going to face. And like Final Boss, the GDD rule will require you putting together sort of everything that you've learned so far on your journey. It's a test of sort of your skills, your endurance, and how you make decisions and execute on them. Can you put it all together and defeat the final boss and win the game? I hope so. The DDD needs to have basically all the information that you and your team need to build the game. You go into full detail over every mechanic, system, every piece of content. You're breaking it down, explaining the functionality clearly, solving any sort of edge cases and weirdness ahead of implementation. Sometimes this is also called a full spec or spec document, but it basically becomes the source of truth for the developers on the game. And while we generally talk about the DDD as a sort of single document, in reality they are often several documents, sometimes in a sort of wiki format. Confluence is a popular sort of tool that a lot of developers use, and that sort of operates in a similar sort of wiki format, or even just separate documents depending on the scope of the game, the type of the game, even team size and things like that. Even sort of specific features may be documented slightly differently, just as needed. Now, typically though, the sections that you might want to include will be informed by the previous work that you've done up until now on the other documentation. So for example, the 10-pager would be a great way to sort of start fleshing out, and that gives you your sort of skeleton structure for your DDD. You just need to sort of answer some of those more detailed questions. But typically you might want to include some of the following. So sort of an overview of the game. You need to, at this point, define and explain all the mechanics, define and explain all of the systems, define and explain all of the content, so that's sort of all the levels, what happens in each of them, things like that. Balancing and economy documentation is useful, so what are the price of all the game items, what is the say damage values of different weapons and items, things like that all need to be documented and understood. Monetization, so how are you going to make money on this game? Is it free to play? Is it sort of premium, etc.? So there's obviously a lot of decisions to be made there, but good to define that in your design document. Is there sort of any sort of narrative requirements here? So what is the full story? What's the dialogue? You need to have all of this stuff figured out before you start building that specific chunk of the narrative. But equally, how are you going to tell that narrative as well? Sort of also an important thing to decide and define. Your production and development plans. So what's the sort of steps you're going to take to make it? How do you break this big task of making a whole game down into more manageable chunks? You should hopefully also have identified some risks at this point from the previous steps, and then what your sort of contingencies will be for that. So what are the sort of potential risks that might impact development or the sort of release of the game, and then sort of what sort of strategies can you employ to mitigate or reduce those risks. And sort of lastly, sort of appendices. This covers things like your sort of glossaries, your references, concept art. Basically sort of if you've got a lot of technical terms, you might want to have a glossary which explains them all. For references, if that's perhaps things like your competitor analysis of your key competitors and comparable titles, that type of thing. So you need to essentially define and detail out how all of the functionality of the game will work, how the systems and rules and mechanics will interact with each other, and answer and plan for any potential issues or edge cases with those. So it's a lot of work, but it doesn't all have to be done at once, and instead you can take it feature at a time and work through each problem one at a time. So that kind of covers from brief and idea all the way through to that fully defined game in 5 easy-ish steps. But there's sort of one more important document that you'll come across, and that is so one last document which you may be familiar with is the pitch deck or game pitch talk. So these are essentially the movie trailer version of your game. If you've seen maybe an arcade machine, you might be familiar with the sort of attract mode that they have. It's basically a sort of noisy, sort of in your face sort of version of the game to sort of try and get your attention, get you to spend some money. And that's typically what your pitch deck is. It's going to include things like the game overview, key features and USPs, game loops, again great to include, I guess a sense of the player progression, team development bio, so who's going to be making it, how much is this game going to cost, and hopefully a development plan as well. So what are you going to achieve and by when? Now, ideally this is what your pitch deck includes, and again this is about selling the game idea. It's the fantasy, the fun of your game, the trailer version of it. And a good pitch is really the difference between your game getting made or remaining in your head forever. So put the effort in where it's needed. And as you can see from this sort of list, a lot of these things are items which you've already mapped out in the previous documentation. So it's helpful to have that in place before then. And it's primarily used to sell the game, either to publishers or to the development team to get buy-in. You might be sharing it with stakeholders or investors for funding, that type of thing. It helps to just align expectations, but it should not be a document that you rely on to get detailed design explanations or anything like that. Alright, so we've covered the documents. Now let's have a look at some best practices for creating design documentation. How do we get those ideas out of your head onto paper? Let's cover some techniques, some tips and tricks for making design documents. So first up, we'll have a look at how to write design documents. There's no sort of magic sauce here. It's keep it simple. Less is more. Keep your descriptions sort of short and concise. Make sure you're using straightforward language. This allows everyone on a team to sort of read, understand, and then contribute to the document as well. In general, I prefer to avoid any sort of unnecessary design jargon. If you do need to use some specific terminology, make sure that that is explained somewhere in a glossary or some such, because people don't understand what that jargon means or the terminology, they can't then ask you the sort of important questions they need to get their job done and deliver the game. So some top tips. Less is more, we kind of covered that. Bullet points. Now these should be points, not paragraphs. Use visuals, diagrams, images, any sort of visual aids are always helpful for getting your ideas across quickly. So things like mock-ups, flow diagrams, or any sort of illustrations of game loops, that sort of thing is really great. And as hard as it is to sort of write all this design documentation, it can be even harder for to get people to actually read it. So do make it as easy as possible for them to sort of read through the documents, find the information that they need that's essential to them. And then once you're happy with your documentation, read it, edit it, and allow readers again to parse that. It's essential that they can find what they need from it. Also, make sure that any sort of naming conventions, things like that, are defined and that you adhere to them throughout the document. So again, that's a sort of proofreading step. It's very important. And yeah, avoid any sort of technical jargon which may confuse or sort of create confusion. So mock-ups. So these are super useful just to get your ideas across quickly. Again, it kind of follows that sort of show, don't tell philosophy. You want to put a picture in front of someone and that just helps them instantly get the idea far faster than any amount of detailed writing will ever manage. Mock-ups are also useful as part of your design process to really sort of plan out and decide sort of important things like order of information, sort of the priority and location of that information as well. What are you going to show to the player? What are you going to purposely hide from the player? So some tips for your mock-ups are sort of wireframes are great. You don't try to sort of reproduce or redefine what the art style should be. That's the job of artists, so leave that to them. Instead, your sort of mock-up should focus on conveying functionality over trying to match any sort of visual fidelity of the game. Next is sort of make sure that your mock-ups are sort of clear and readable. So each element should be easily identified, but again, it doesn't need to look like an in-game asset or anything like that. Just clear visuals are the preferred route. If in doubt, annotate the mock-up as well when needed. This just makes sure that everyone does know what they're looking at. Another sort of useful thing is to sort of match the proportions and scale of the screen or display. So if you're making a mobile game, ensure that you're matching sort of whatever device you're going to be targeting in terms of the proportions and screen ratios, that type of thing. If there's an existing UI already in place that your feature is now sort of adding on to, make sure that you take that into account, the position and scale of that as well, because again, every bit of information you add onto the game sort of increases that sort of cognitive load for the players, and you want to make sure that it's parsable, manageable, and sort of an enjoyable experience. The order of information also sort of important. So once you've understood the flow of the feature, do consider what that is. I think another important thing to sort of bear in mind here as well is that not all of the information needs to be shown at once, so do consider things like staging that information out. When does the player need to know the thing, and display it then. I think also once you are building your mockups and making them, try and use that sort of consistent visual design language, tailor it per project if you need as well. I think that also sort of just helps create a sort of consistent language. It means when people are looking over your mockups, they will grow to be able to read them better. So flow diagrams, another helpful visual aid. They're able to sort of visualize a sort of process, the user experience of a complex system, and it just makes it easier to understand because you break down the process from start to finish in this sort of nice, clear, step-by-step method. They're also really useful for documenting these complex systems. You can use it to identify potential issues, even spot any edge cases, and resolve them ahead of time. They're used to sort of map out the full process and know that you're creating the most efficient and most engaging system you can. It's also just a really handy way to sort of plan the structure ahead of implementation as well. So having that in place before you even sort of start building it is super valuable. So let's look at some good and bad examples of them. So it's important when you're creating your flow diagrams that they are sort of readable, that the structure is both sort of clear and they have a defined sort of starting and end point. It's also important that they're accurate, so make sure that all the steps that are shown are in the process and that they're sort of move to the next step as expected. Make sure that it's detailed, so give yourself plenty of space when you're mapping them out. And start with a desired sort of user flow as well. That's my sort of top tip really there, is start with what the expected user flow is and then sort of map out all the sort of branches off of that. So hopefully you could spot the good one and not the bad one. But again, those top tips, so make that flow clear, have that nice start and end point, include all the steps and choices along the way, and start with the desired flow. Next up is game loops. So game loops are obviously super important. There are a sort of few key components that you want to make sure you include in your game loops. The first up would be the goal. So this is the thing that motivates the player. It's what compels them to take action, whether it's rescuing the princess, solving some puzzle, or achieving a new high score. This is the thing that's going to give the player that sense of purpose and direction as they play through the game. Then you have actions. So this is the thing that the player is doing to achieve the goal. These actions can be, the different things like combat, exploration, or puzzle solving, and it really depends on the sort of genre and design of your game, what the specific actions are. But then, once they've performed that action, the next thing they need to see is feedback. So this is a kind of a crucial element because it tells the player how they performed that action. If it was sort of a good action, then positive feedback reinforces their sense of accomplishment. Negative feedback obviously tells them to sort of reassess and maybe try a different strategy next time. And then finally, sort of progression. So this is the sort of the final little part of there, and this is what keeps them engaged. Progression refers to this sense of advancement and growth within the game, and it can manifest in a few different ways, either by sort of unlocking levels, maybe acquiring new abilities, or unlocking equipment, or even things like gaining access to additional challenges is also a sort of a nice way of sort of rewarding players' progression. It just keeps them engaged and gives them that sense of satisfaction. So hopefully this is a good demonstration to you of why creating that core loop is essential. It's what makes the game fun and meaningful for players. It's also one of the hardest sort of design challenges that you may come up against. So a wee bit more top tips on that coming. Yes, so breaking down a game into units of time, or the sort of time scale, is a sort of a really great way of focusing in on that core gameplay and identifying the mechanics and the sort of the core loops of your game. So often, as designers, we can get caught up describing things like the thematic elements of the game, and we might lose sight of the very important thing, which is gameplay, the thing the player is actually doing. So what are the actions and choices that the player has that keep them engaged? And breaking down your game into these time units really helps plan out the actions and the mechanics that the player is going to be performing. So in this example, we see a typical third-person or FPS shooter game. It's no particular one, it's just a sort of invented example, but typically moment to moment you might be doing something like spotting enemies, maybe deciding to shoot the enemies or avoid them, and then advancing through the level. Minute to minute, the sort of longer term sort of experience is I'm entering maybe new rooms and areas, I'm finding kind of cool new weapons, and then I'm clearing rooms, maybe using those cool new weapons too. Hour to hour, it's these longer term objectives, clearing missions, maybe finding gear and upgrades, and then choosing maybe a new loadout to try in the next mission. And then day to day, as kind of that progression element, you're maybe unlocking things like new characters that you can play as, you might be completing some achievements, and spending currency and cosmetics that you've earned. So you can take this really as far as you want. If you're working on a long tail sort of live service game, then you might even extrapolate this out into sort of the year to year loop if you want. It also can apply to different genres. So in this example here is an example of a platform game, and this is just a sort of a quick breakdown, but moment to moment you might be doing something like running, jumping, collecting coins. You could be clearing screens in the minute to minute and avoiding sort of new hazards and enemies as you sort of make your way to the end of the level. Hour to hour you are clearing entire levels, you might even be coming up against bosses and defeating them, and doing sort of more exploration like finding shortcuts within the levels and between levels. Day to day you're sort of clearing whole areas, maybe setting new high scores, that type of thing on the way towards finishing the game. So it's a really useful sort of way to think about your game, and I would suggest that you try breaking down your own game ideas in this way to help sort of find any gaps or weaknesses in your own core loops. So is it clear to you what the actions and choices are that players have available to them at any particular time? And ask yourself questions like, is that actually an engaging experience? And also, is it the desired player experience? In conclusion, design documentation is an essential communication tool used by designers to describe a game's functionality and form. Teams will use this document to make the game, to design specification and deliver the desired player experience. Creating good design documentation takes time and effort, and designers must consider what information to include in a document, as well as what is the best way to format this information, taking into account the purpose of the document and who will be using it. Good documentation can take a game from idea to reality. Thanks for listening, everybody. Bye.